asleep or had gone away. There remained awake only Socrates, Aristophanes, and Agathon, who were drinking out of a large goblet which they passed round, and Socrates was discoursing to them. Aristodemus did not hear the beginning of the discourse, and he was only half awake, but the chief thing which he remembered was Socrates compelling the other two to acknowledge that the genius of comedy was the same as that of tragedy, and that the true artist in tragedy was an artist in comedy also. To this they assented, being drowsy, and not quite following the argument. And first of all Aristophanes dropped off. Then, when the day was already dawning, Agathon. Socrates, when he had laid them to sleep, rose to depart. Aristodemus, as his manner was, following him. At the Lyceum he took a bath, and passed the day as usual. In the evening he retired to rest at his own house. With this quality of temperance was combined in Socrates a rare measure of independence and moral courage. He was never an active politician, but as every Athenian citizen was called at some time or another to public office, he found himself on a critical occasion responsible for putting a certain proposition to the vote in the assembly. It was a moment of intense excitement. A great victory had just been won, but the generals who had achieved the success had neglected to recover the corpses of the dead, or to save the shipwrecked. It was proposed to take a vote of life or death on all the generals collectively. Socrates, as it happened, was one of the committee whose duty it was to put the question to the assembly. But the proposition was in itself illegal, and Socrates, with some other members of the committee, refused to submit it to the vote. Every kind of pressure was brought to bear upon the recalcitrant officers. Orators threatened, friends besought, the mob clamoured and denounced. Finally, all but Socrates gave way. He alone, an old man in office for the first time, had the courage to obey his conscience and the law in face of an angry populace crying for blood. And as he could stand against a mob, so he could stand against a despot. At the time when Athens was ruled by the 30 tyrants, he was ordered, with 4 others, to arrest a man whom the authorities wished to put out of the way. The man was guilty of no crime, and Socrates refused. "I went quietly home," he says, "and no doubt I should have been put to death for it, if the government had not shortly after come to an end." These, however, were exceptional episodes in the career of a man who was never a prominent politician. The main interest of Socrates was intellectual and moral, an interest, however, rather practical than speculative. For though he was charged in his indictment with preaching atheism, he appears in fact to have concerned himself little or nothing with either theological or physical enquiries. He was careful in his observance of all prescribed religious rites, and probably accepted the gods as powers of the natural world and authors of human institutions and laws. His originality lay not in any purely speculative views, but in the pertinacious curiosity, practical in its origin and aim, with which he attacked and sifted the ethical conceptions of his time. What is justice? What is piety? What is temperance? These were the kinds of questions he never tired of raising, pointing out contradictions and inconsistencies in current ideas, and awakening doubts which, if negative in form, were positive and fruitful in effect. His method in pursuing these inquiries was that of cross-examination. In the streets, in the market, in the gymnasia, at meetings grave and gay, in season or out of season, he raised his points of definition. The city was in a ferment around him, young men and boys followed and hung on his lips wherever he went. By the charm of his personality, his gracious courtesy and wit, and the large and generous atmosphere of a sympathy always at hand to temper to particular persons the rigours of a generalizing logic, he drew to himself, with a fascination not more of the intellect than of the heart, all that was best and brightest in the youth of Athens. His relation to his young disciples was that of a lover and a friend, and the stimulus given by his dialectics to their keen and eager minds was supplemented and reinforced by the appeal to their admiration and love of his sweet and virile personality. Only in ancient Athens, perhaps, could such a character and such conditions have met. The sociable outdoor city life, the meeting places in the open air, and especially the gymnasia, frequented by young and old, not more for exercise of the body than for recreation of the mind. The nimble and versatile Athenian wits, trained to preternatural acuteness by the debates of the law courts and the assembly. All this was exactly the environment fitted to develop and sustain a genius at once so subtle and so humane as that of Socrates. It is the concrete presentation of this city life that lends so peculiar a charm to the dialogues of Plato. The spirit of metaphysics puts on the human form, and dialectic walks the streets and contends in the palaestra. It would be impossible to convey by citation the cumulative effect of this constant reference in Plato to a human background, but a single excerpt may perhaps help us to realize the conditions under which Socrates lived and worked. Here then is a description of the scene in one of those gymnasia in which he was wont to hold his conversations. Upon entering, we found that the boys had just been sacrificing, and this part of the festival was nearly at an end. They were all in white array, and games at dice were going on among them. Most of them were in the outer court, amusing themselves, but some were in a corner of the apoditarium, playing at odd and even with a number of dice, which they took out of little wicker baskets. There was also a circle of lookers-on, one of whom was Lysis. He was standing among the other boys and youths, having a crown upon his head, like a fair vision, and not less worthy of praise for his goodness than for his beauty. We left them, and went over to the opposite